When German soldiers were captured in 1943 and shipped across the Atlantic, they braced themselves for starvation, beatings, and humiliation. They had been told that America was weak, divided, and decadent. But the first shock came not from barbed wire or bayonets. It came in the form of ice cream sundaes and bottles of Coca-Cola. Imagine battle-hardened Africa Corps veterans, who had never even tasted a chocolate bar during the war, suddenly sitting in a prison camp where 5 cents could buy them a Coke, where ice cream was served even to the enemy, and where Thanksgiving dinners were prepared for men who just days earlier had fought against the United States. For thousands of German POWs, the real defeat wasn't on the battlefield. It was in discovering a society so prosperous it could hand out luxury to its prisoners, while their own families back home starved. This is the untold story of how ice cream, Coca-Cola, and candy bars shattered Nazi ideology more effectively than any bullet or bomb. Expecting starvation, finding ice cream. When the first German prisoners of war stepped off the Liberty ships onto American soil in 1943, their expectations were grim. They had surrendered after brutal campaigns in North Africa or Italy, had been loaded into troop ships under armed guard, and were now thousands of miles from home. Nazi propaganda had prepared them for the worst. They were told America was a land of criminals, weak men, and racial chaos, hardly capable of running a modern war, much less treating prisoners humanely. Many expected torture, starvation, or to be worked to death like the prisoners they had seen in German-run camps across Europe. And then, something happened that none of them could have imagined. Instead of starvation rations, some were handed meals that included fresh bread, meat, potatoes, and even dessert. Instead of brutality, they encountered American guards who, though firm, were not vindictive. But the true shock, the memory that POWs would later recount with wide-eyed disbelief, came in the form of something so ordinary to Americans that it barely registered: ice cream and Coca-Cola. The first taste. Imagine being a young German soldier who had grown up in the austerity of the 1930s, then spent years in the desert eating army rations of hard biscuits and thin soup. Food had been scarce in wartime Germany, even for civilians, with meat heavily rationed and luxuries like chocolate almost impossible to find. Coca-Cola had been banned as an enemy drink, and ice cream was something most German children had never tasted, let alone soldiers. Now picture that soldier being offered an ice cream sundae in a U.S. Army mess hall. Cold, sweet, creamy, something so far removed from the battlefield that it felt like another planet. Or the clink of a Coca-Cola bottle being opened, the fizz bubbling up as he tasted carbonation for the first time in his life. Many POWs later admitted that this was the moment they realized everything they had been told about America was a lie. Food as a weapon stronger than propaganda. Historians like Arnold Kramer, who spent decades interviewing German POWs, discovered a consistent theme. The abundance of American food had a more devastating effect on Nazi ideology than any pamphlet, speech, or interrogation. Soldiers who had been told that America was collapsing under corruption now saw that even in the middle of a world war, the U.S. could afford to give prisoners more calories and luxuries than German civilians at home. This revelation cut deep. One POW put it bluntly: "We came from a land where children were hungry, where women stood in lines for hours to get a few potatoes. And here we were, enemies of America, eating steak, bread, and ice cream." It broke something inside us. The 5-cent Coca-Cola. The price of Coca-Cola was another symbol that shocked the German mind. 5 cents. That was all it cost in the camps, the same as it did for any American soldier or civilian. The message was clear. Coca-Cola was so abundant that even prisoners could drink it endlessly. German POWs, who had grown up in a society where luxuries were reserved for the elite, were stunned that America treated even its enemies with such equality when it came to small pleasures. For men who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler, the fizzing bubbles of Coca-Cola carried an unexpected lesson. America's strength came not from oppression or propaganda, but from a society so wealthy it could share with everyone, even captured foes. Chocolate bars and care packages. Another unforgettable detail was chocolate. For German children in the 1940s, chocolate was a near-mythical item. Most had never tasted it, as cocoa imports had collapsed and rationing made it inaccessible. When POWs in America were given Hershey bars, many didn't eat them immediately. Instead, they carefully packed them up and mailed them home to their families in Germany, using Red Cross channels that allowed parcels to be sent. Letters from German civilians described children bursting into tears of joy when they tasted chocolate for the first time, sent from fathers imprisoned thousands of miles away. The irony was striking. German soldiers, captured and defeated, were feeding their families through American generosity. And with every sweet bite, the myth of German superiority crumbled further. Ice cream on Liberty ships. Even the journey to America could include moments of abundance. On some Liberty ships transporting POWs across the Atlantic, ice cream machines were installed, not for the prisoners, but for the American sailors. Yet when the sailors shared their frozen treats with German captives, it left an indelible mark. To men who had survived on thin gruel, the fact that their enemy had so much food it could casually hand out ice cream on a warship was almost incomprehensible. One German veteran recalled years later, "That was the moment I knew the war was lost. If they had ice cream on their ships, how could we ever compete?" The psychological earthquake. What happened in those prison camps was more than comfort. It was a psychological earthquake. The German worldview, carefully constructed through years of propaganda, collapsed in the face of everyday American abundance. In Germany, the government rationed bread slices and preached about sacrifice for the fatherland. In America, a soldier could walk into a diner, order a steak dinner, a slice of pie, and a Coke, all for pocket change. And even enemy prisoners were given a taste of that life. This was not just generosity. It was a revelation of America's industrial might and democratic values. The abundance of food was proof that freedom, not dictatorship, had produced a stronger society. A blow to Nazi ideology. Nazi ideology had emphasized scarcity, sacrifice, and the idea that Germans were a superior race destined to dominate weaker peoples. Yet here were ordinary Americans, farmers, workers, guards, living better than German officers. Here were enemy soldiers drinking Coca-Cola while German civilians starved. Every scoop of ice cream, every bottle of soda, every chocolate bar chipped away at the idea of German superiority. By the time many of these POWs were repatriated after the war, they carried with them not just memories of captivity, but an entirely new perspective on democracy and abundance. The beginning of transformation. Part 1 of this story sets the stage. German POWs arriving in America braced for brutality, but instead confronted kindness, abundance, and luxuries beyond their imagination. Ice cream, Coca-Cola, and chocolate may seem trivial, but for men raised under dictatorship and scarcity, these foods carried a deeper meaning. They were symbols of a society that could win wars not only with weapons, but with prosperity. And as we'll see in the coming parts, these small pleasures would go on to reshape the very way German prisoners thought about freedom, democracy, and America itself. The arrival at camp. After crossing the Atlantic in Liberty ships, guarded by destroyers against U-boat attacks, German prisoners were unloaded at ports like New York, Boston, and Norfolk. From there, they were transported in guarded trains to hundreds of prison camps scattered across the American South, Midwest, and Plains. The journey itself was often bewildering. POWs peered out of train windows at sprawling farms, endless fields of wheat and corn, and towns lit brightly at night despite wartime. In Germany, blackouts had been enforced since 1939, cities were in ruins, and food shortages grew worse by the day. Yet here, in the heartland of their enemy, it seemed as if war barely touched the land. When they finally reached the camps, many expected brutality. Instead, they encountered barracks, recreation fields, libraries, and mess halls. Guards were armed and watchtowers loomed, but the atmosphere was orderly rather than menacing. Food as the great equalizer. The daily rations astonished the prisoners. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs were supposed to receive the same quantity and quality of food as American soldiers. That meant hearty meals of meat, potatoes, bread, vegetables, coffee, and, most surprisingly, dessert. Menus included dishes like roast beef with gravy, fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fruit salad, and puddings. While shortages did occur, especially late in the war, the overall standard was astonishing compared to Germany. Some camps even had ice cream on the menu several times a week. POWs recalled standing in line with trays, scarcely able to believe they were being offered a scoop of vanilla or chocolate ice cream in a prison camp. In Germany, civilians were grinding acorns for coffee substitutes. Here, prisoners were eating better than officers back home. Coca-Cola in the canteen. Each camp also had a canteen where POWs could purchase small luxuries with camp scrip, money issued in tokens rather than cash. The most popular item was Coca-Cola. At just 5 cents a bottle, it was endlessly available. For German soldiers, this was mind-blowing. In Germany, even beer had become scarce by 1944. Soda was virtually unheard of. Yet here, their guards casually drank Coke, tossed the empties away, and thought nothing of it. Some POWs would stare at the red and white logo, wondering how a nation at war could afford to keep producing luxuries in such volume. A few would write home about it, describing Coca-Cola with the same awe one might reserve for a rare treasure. For them, it wasn't just a drink. It was a symbol of American abundance. Holidays in captivity. American generosity shone brightest on holidays. On Thanksgiving and Christmas, camps organized special meals with turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pies, cakes, and sometimes even ice cream sundaes. For men far from home, it was disorienting. They were enemies of the United States, yet they were being treated to a feast that would have seemed extravagant even in peacetime Germany. One POW later recalled, "It was the first time I ever tasted pumpkin pie. I was a prisoner, and yet I thought, if this is captivity, what is life like for the free?" Red Cross oversight. Part of this abundance came from international oversight. The International Red Cross regularly inspected camps, ensuring food, medical care, and humane treatment. Packages from the Red Cross also included items like chocolate, coffee, and canned goods, further shocking prisoners who had grown used to scarcity. For Germans indoctrinated with the idea that America was corrupt and cruel, the presence of neutral inspectors reinforced the reality that this was no propaganda show. They were truly being treated better than they had expected. Recreation and normalcy. Life inside the camps included more than just food. There were sports fields where prisoners played soccer, handball, and even organized leagues. Some camps had orchestras, theater groups, and libraries. Others offered classes in English or vocational training. But food always remained central to their memories. Even decades later, when asked about their captivity, many POWs skipped over details of guards or barracks and immediately described the meals. It was the abundance of food and the luxury of ice cream and Coca-Cola that stayed with them. Psychological unraveling of propaganda. The daily routine of good food slowly unraveled years of indoctrination. German soldiers had been told they belonged to the master race, destined to rule over lesser peoples. Yet here, in an enemy camp, they were eating more generously than German civilians. Worse for their ideology, the men feeding them weren't Aryan officers, but ordinary Americans, farm boys, mechanics, clerks turned soldiers, many of them from immigrant backgrounds or minority groups despised by Nazi propaganda. And yet these men commanded more resources, more food, and more prosperity than the German Reich at its height. Each bite of apple pie, each bottle of Coke, became an unspoken lesson. Everything they had been told was wrong. The letters home. Perhaps the most powerful impact of all came through the mail. POWs were allowed to write home, and many chose to describe the abundance they were experiencing. They sent chocolate bars or cans of coffee through Red Cross packages, tokens of American life that shocked their families in bombed-out German cities. These letters often read like dispatches from another planet. "They feed us so much I am gaining weight. I drank something called Coca-Cola, a sweet drink with bubbles. Children would love it. There was ice cream today. Can you imagine? Ice cream, for prisoners. For families living on meager rations." These letters carried both relief and astonishment. Their captured sons were better fed than they were. And though it was never spoken openly, many recognized the truth. Germany was losing not just on the battlefield, but in the ability to sustain its people. The first sounds of jazz and swing. When German POWs settled into their camps, they quickly discovered that food wasn't the only surprise. At night, across the barracks, radios crackled with American stations. For the first time, many prisoners heard swing, jazz, and the lively rhythms of Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, and Duke Ellington. This music was the complete opposite of Nazi-approved marches and classical pieces. Jazz had been condemned in Germany as degenerate music, often banned outright because of its African-American roots and American popularity. Yet here it was, played freely, joyfully, without shame. Prisoners couldn't resist tapping their feet. Soon, makeshift bands formed inside the camps. Guitars, accordions, even improvised drums accompanied songs they learned from American records. The rhythm infected them, and whether they admitted it or not, they were enchanted. Movie nights behind barbed wire. Even more shocking were the films. Camps often screened Hollywood movies for entertainment. POWs sat on wooden benches, guarded but relaxed, as the projector flickered to life. They saw actors like Clark Gable, Humphrey Bogart, and Rita Hayworth. They saw comedies, romances, westerns, genres almost absent from wartime Germany. These films revealed something startling. America's culture wasn't built on fear or rigid hierarchy, but on individualism, humor, and freedom. Women appeared on screen as glamorous, independent, and outspoken, so different from the strict Nazi ideal of motherhood and obedience. For many German soldiers, it was their first glimpse of a society where entertainment celebrated joy rather than discipline. Newspapers and freedom of speech. In some camps, POWs were allowed access to American newspapers, albeit censored for sensitive information. Even with restrictions, the openness shocked them. They read editorials criticizing government decisions, cartoons mocking politicians, and letters from readers debating policies. In Nazi Germany, the press was a weapon of the state. Here, in the very nation they had been told was hypocritical and corrupt, ordinary citizens could openly criticize their leaders without fear of arrest. One POW later recalled, "We saw more freedom in an American newspaper than we had known in our entire lives." Church services and religious freedom. Religion also played a powerful role in this cultural re-education. Chaplains organized church services, and POWs were free to attend. Catholic, Protestant, and occasionally Jewish services were held, and prisoners were astonished that all were respected equally. In Nazi Germany, Jewish worship was persecuted, and Catholic priests were harassed or imprisoned. Yet here, even in wartime, religious freedom was upheld. This quiet but powerful message undermined years of propaganda about American godlessness or moral weakness. Recreation, baseball versus fussball. Sports fields were a central part of camp life. At first, POWs organized their own soccer matches. Guards often came to watch, sometimes even joining in. But soon, Americans introduced them to baseball. The rules seemed bizarre, running in a diamond, swinging at pitches, calling safe and out. Yet curiosity overcame suspicion. Some POWs tried it, laughing at their awkward attempts. The contrast between soccer and baseball was symbolic. Soccer, familiar and European, represented the old world they came from. Baseball, uniquely American, symbolized a new culture, playful, competitive, yet strangely democratic. Anyone could hit a home run. Anyone could strike out. Small luxuries and daily wonders. Beyond sports and entertainment, the daily luxuries left lasting impressions. POWs saw guards smoking endless cigarettes, while in Germany, tobacco was strictly rationed. They watched American soldiers toss away half-eaten sandwiches, while back home, families scraped for crumbs. One prisoner remembered being stunned when a guard casually poured out a bottle of Coca-Cola after drinking only half. In Germany, he later said, such waste would have been unthinkable. But for them, it was nothing. It meant they had so much, they could afford not to finish. The ideological collision. Each cultural encounter chipped away at the walls of Nazi ideology. Jazz and swing revealed joy where propaganda had promised decadence. Movies showed a society thriving on freedom and individuality, not conformity. Newspapers exposed a democracy strong enough to withstand criticism. Religion was practiced openly, without fear. Baseball and Coca-Cola made prisoners feel that abundance wasn't just material. It was cultural, woven into the very life of America. For German POWs, the shock was not just that America had food and luxuries. It was that America had freedom, and that freedom seemed to generate both wealth and happiness. Seeds of transformation. This cultural immersion planted seeds that would bloom after the war. Many POWs, once devoted Nazis, returned home with a new perspective. They told their families of ice cream and Coca-Cola, but also of newspapers, movies, and music that celebrated life rather than glorified death. Some became outspoken advocates for democracy in post-war Germany. Others carried quiet memories that shaped their political views for decades. In either case, the cultural shock of America's abundance and freedom proved just as powerful as its military victories. The weight of propaganda. Every German soldier entered captivity carrying years of indoctrination. Nazi propaganda had drilled into them that America was weak, decadent, racially divided, and incapable of true strength. Joseph Goebbels' speeches painted Americans as soft consumers who would never endure hardship. Many POWs expected brutality upon capture. They braced for starvation, forced labor, and humiliation. Instead, they found themselves given warm meals, medical care, and, unbelievably, ice cream and Coca-Cola. The immediate reaction was confusion, even suspicion. Some thought it was a trick. Others whispered that it was temporary. Propaganda meant to soften them up. Yet as weeks turned into months, the reality sank in. The kindness wasn't a trick. It was simply how America operated. Food as a weapon of the mind. Nothing challenged their beliefs more than food. Ice cream, chocolate, unlimited bread, canned fruit, luxuries they hadn't seen in years. Psychologists later argued that food itself became a weapon of re-education. A man who expected punishment but received kindness began to question everything he believed about his captors. Hunger had shaped much of wartime Europe, and now, abundance reshaped the prisoners' minds. One POW later confessed, "I stopped believing Goebbels the moment I tasted my first chocolate bar." Respect instead of humiliation. The American approach to handling POWs wasn't rooted in cruelty. Guards enforced discipline, yes, but without unnecessary humiliation. Prisoners were treated as men, not animals. They were given uniforms, medical checkups, and even pay for their labor. For men who had been raised on the idea that enemies must be crushed and degraded, this was revolutionary. Respect humanized them. Instead of being broken, they were given dignity. And dignity made them receptive to new ideas. The contrast with Soviet fear. Word quickly spread inside the camps about what awaited Germans captured by the Soviets. Letters and rumors told of starvation, brutal forced marches, and Siberian camps where survival rates dropped below 65%. The comparison was stark. In America, survival rates for POWs hovered around 96%. Simply put, surrendering to America meant life. Surrendering to the Soviets meant likely death. This knowledge intensified the psychological effect. Prisoners didn't just feel fortunate, they felt rescued. America became, paradoxically, their savior. Shattered superiority complex. The Nazi regime had instilled in Germans a belief in their cultural and racial superiority. Yet here, inside barbed wire camps, that myth collapsed. They saw ordinary American guards, sometimes younger than themselves, casually throwing away food that could have fed German families for weeks. They saw women driving trucks, working in offices, living lives unimaginable in Nazi Germany. They saw factories producing more planes in a week than Germany could in a year. Slowly, the myth of German superiority was replaced by grudging respect for American strength, and then admiration. Cognitive dissonance, the inner struggle. The process wasn't simple. Many POWs went through deep internal struggles. How could the decadent Americans defeat the Wehrmacht, the greatest army in Europe? How could a nation of immigrants be richer, stronger, and freer than the German Reich? Why were they being treated better by their enemies than by their own leaders? This mental clash, what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, forced them to reevaluate their worldview. Some resisted, clinging to Nazi beliefs. But many others surrendered not just their weapons, but their ideology. Kindness as a strategic weapon. Historians now see this American approach as a deliberate form of psychological warfare. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, but America went further, offering dignity, abundance, and even small pleasures like movies and ice cream. Why? Because kindness eroded loyalty to Hitler far more effectively than cruelty ever could. By showing POWs the reality of American life, prosperous, free, and humane, the U.S. turned enemies into future allies. Many former POWs later admitted that their first lessons in democracy came not in classrooms, but in prison camps. Seeds of post-war democracy. This transformation had long-term consequences. Thousands of former POWs went home after 1945 carrying stories of ice cream, Coca-Cola, newspapers, and jazz. Back in ruined Germany, their tales spread. Families who had endured starvation and oppression heard about a land where even prisoners ate better than free Germans. For many, these stories became the foundation of post-war admiration for America. Former soldiers became teachers, politicians, and community leaders in West Germany. Their first-hand experiences shaped a generation that embraced democracy rather than returning to authoritarianism. A quiet but profound victory. The battlefield victories of World War II were dramatic, but the psychological victory inside POW camps may have been just as important. By feeding prisoners ice cream, by letting them hear jazz, by treating them as men instead of animals, America planted an idea that no army could destroy. Freedom, prosperity, and dignity were stronger weapons than fear, starvation, and cruelty. First impressions, barbed wire but open skies. When German POWs first arrived in America, they expected cramped barracks, starvation rations, and brutal guards. Instead, they entered camps that, though surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, felt surprisingly open compared to the claustrophobic trenches and bombed-out cities they had left behind. The barracks were wooden, heated in winter, with enough bunks for privacy. Many described them as more comfortable than the army barracks they had known in Germany. Windows let in light, and in the evenings, prisoners could walk freely inside designated compounds. For men who had braced themselves for darkness and chains, this relative freedom was shocking. The rhythm of the day. A typical day began early, with roll call at dawn. Guards counted the men, and after a quick breakfast, often including eggs, toast, fruit, and sometimes even coffee, the day unfolded with structure. Work assignments. Many prisoners were sent to nearby farms, factories, or logging camps, always under contract and with pay credited to them. Others stayed in camp, working in kitchens, workshops, or maintaining facilities. Education. Classes were offered in English, mathematics, sciences, and even democratic political theory. For men raised in authoritarian schooling, this open style of learning was both confusing and liberating. Meals. Lunch was often substantial: meat, potatoes, vegetables. Dinner sometimes included dessert. Prisoners quickly realized they were eating more, and better, than their own families back home. Evening leisure. After work, evenings brought sports, music, or access to camp libraries. Camps even organized orchestras, theater groups, and discussion circles. The effect was profound. Instead of feeling crushed by captivity, many POWs felt themselves slowly rehabilitated into ordinary human life. Work as dignity, not punishment. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs could be required to work, but not in dangerous or humiliating jobs. America followed this rule closely. On farms, German POWs picked cotton, harvested wheat, or plowed fields. They were often amazed at the size of American farms. One farm in Texas could equal the area of an entire German village. Farmers sometimes shared food with the men, offered them coffee, or even treated them as temporary members of the family. These work assignments gave prisoners dignity. They earned pay, small, but enough to buy items at camp canteens, including the treasured Coca-Cola, candy, and cigarettes. For men stripped of agency by war, the ability to work for reward and choice restored a sense of manhood. Learning behind barbed wire. Perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of camp life was education. American authorities encouraged it, believing that exposure to ideas would break Nazi indoctrination. Classes ranged from English language lessons to discussions about democracy, philosophy, and world history. Some camps had lecture halls, libraries with thousands of books, and even newspapers printed by POWs themselves. One prisoner later recalled, "It was in captivity that I first learned what democracy truly meant. We debated freely without fear, something I had never known in Germany." The transformation was quiet but lasting. Many who attended these classes later became teachers, politicians, or professionals who helped rebuild democratic Germany after 1945. Music, movies, and Coca-Cola. Leisure activities carried enormous weight in shaping perceptions. Camps hosted orchestras where German musicians played Bach, Beethoven, and Wagner, but also jazz, swing, and American popular songs they had never heard before. American films were sometimes shown. For soldiers raised on Nazi propaganda that painted America as corrupt, seeing Hollywood comedies or westerns was bewildering. Prisoners laughed, relaxed, and for a few hours forgot they were captives. And then, of course, there was Coca-Cola and ice cream. 4 or 5 cents at the canteen, a POW could buy a Coke, something unimaginable in war-torn Europe. Ice cream sundaes became symbols of American abundance, and men wrote home about this strange frozen treat that their families could scarcely imagine. Holidays in captivity. Even holidays were recognized. At Christmas, some camps allowed prisoners to decorate trees, sing carols, and attend religious services. At Thanksgiving, POWs were astonished to be served turkey, stuffing, and pumpkin pie. For men who thought they would be punished or starved, these holiday celebrations felt almost surreal. They were reminders that even enemies were treated as humans with dignity. Letters home. Perhaps nothing connected prisoners more deeply to their humanity than the ability to write letters home. Under the supervision of the Red Cross, prisoners exchanged mail with families in Germany. In these letters, POWs described food, freedom, and kindness. They often avoided direct praise of America for fear of censorship, but families understood the truth. Their men were safe, even thriving. Some prisoners even sent American chocolate, coffee, or canned goods home through care packages. For starving German families, these gifts seemed miraculous, building communities. Over time, camps evolved into small communities. Prisoners formed friendships, studied, worked, and dreamed of the future. Some resisted, clinging to Nazi ideology, but many more adapted. They realized that life behind American barbed wire was often better than life they had known as soldiers under Hitler. What began as captivity slowly became a strange kind of liberation. The first Coca-Cola. For many German POWs, the very first shock came in the form of a glass bottle, Coca-Cola. They had heard of it before the war, sometimes as an exotic drink found only in American films or in rare German cafes where it was sold before 1939. But in most of Europe, Coca-Cola was unknown. To a young soldier who had marched across deserts or frozen battlefields, the idea of a sweet, fizzy, cold drink was unimaginable. When the first POWs tasted it, reactions varied. Some thought it strange, too sweet. Others instantly loved it. But the overwhelming impression was this: America had so much wealth it could create entire industries just to make people happy. And then they learned it cost only 5 cents. The realization that American civilians, and even prisoners, could drink Coca-Cola whenever they wanted shattered the Nazi myth of a starving, weak America. The ice cream revelation. If Coca-Cola surprised them, ice cream astonished them. In wartime Germany, ice cream was nearly non-existent. Dairy products were rationed, sugar was scarce, and refrigeration was a luxury. Many young soldiers had never tasted ice cream in their lives. Now, aboard Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic or inside American camps, they were handed bowls of vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry ice cream. One POW later said, "At that moment, I realized the war was lost. A nation that could give ice cream to its prisoners had resources beyond imagination. The creamy sweetness, the chill on their tongues, it was not just food. It was proof that America was living in another world, a world of abundance they could scarcely comprehend." Candy bars and chocolate dreams. Chocolate was perhaps the most emotional shock. German children had grown up with it, but by the 1940s it had vanished from most German households. Soldiers at the front had long forgotten its taste. In American camps, chocolate bars were available at the canteen. Hershey's, Baby Ruth, Milky Way, brand names that would become legendary in post-war Germany. POWs wrote home describing these candy bars, sometimes exaggerating as though they were describing treasure. Some even sent chocolate back in Red Cross parcels, where it became a symbol of survival for starving families. For German soldiers, the chocolate bar was more than sweetness. It was proof that American children ate better in wartime than German soldiers at the front. The scale of abundance. These foods weren't isolated treats. They represented a cultural system. POWs soon realized that Coca-Cola wasn't rare, it was everywhere. Ice cream wasn't luxury, it was everyday. Candy wasn't treasure, it was routine. The abundance was shocking. America had turned pleasure into industry, and industry into abundance. For German soldiers raised in a society of scarcity, this was overwhelming. It destroyed the idea that Americans were weak. If anything, abundance became proof of strength. Everyday consumerism. Beyond food, POWs noticed ordinary consumer goods. Shoes, radios, newspapers, even the casual waste of cigarettes or food scraps left them speechless. A guard might toss away half a sandwich, and a German prisoner would stare, thinking how that one sandwich could feed a family back home. It was not cruelty. It was simply normal in a land so wealthy that waste became invisible. To the POWs, this waste was as shocking as abundance. It proved America was producing more than it needed, something Germany could never imagine under rationing and bombing. Psychological earthquake. These experiences created what historians call a psychological earthquake. Nazi propaganda had taught Germans to believe in America's weakness. Yet the evidence was undeniable. A nation that could serve ice cream and Coca-Cola to its prisoners was stronger than any army of the Reich. Slowly, admiration replaced hatred. Soldiers whispered among themselves, "If this is how they treat prisoners, how do they treat their own people?" The conclusion was impossible to ignore. America's strength wasn't just military. It was cultural, industrial, and moral. The power of small pleasures. Historians now argue that these small pleasures, Coca-Cola, ice cream, candy bars, did more to break Nazi ideology than propaganda leaflets or lectures. They were tangible. They could be tasted, held, and remembered. No speech could compare to the shock of a POW biting into his first chocolate bar after years of war. For many, these small experiences became the turning points of their worldview. From shock to admiration. Over time, shock turned into admiration. POWs began to associate America not just with power, but with comfort, kindness, and pleasure. One former prisoner later said, "We went into the camps as soldiers of Hitler. We left as admirers of America." And it all began with something as simple as ice cream and Coca-Cola. A Christmas they never expected. For many German prisoners, the most unforgettable moment in captivity came at Christmas. They expected punishment, perhaps silence or isolation. Instead, camps were decorated with trees, garlands, and lights. Guards handed out candy and small gifts. Some camps organized choirs that sang carols, both German and American. In several camps, POWs were astonished to find they could attend Christmas services, complete with choirs and sermons. The message wasn't propaganda, it was faith. One prisoner recalled, "I thought they would humiliate us. Instead, they let us celebrate Christmas. In that moment, I felt more human than I had in years." This recognition of their humanity broke through years of indoctrination. Christmas, instead of being a reminder of home lost, became a bridge between enemies. Thanksgiving, a feast beyond imagination. Few POWs had ever heard of Thanksgiving before America. Now, they were served roast turkey, stuffing, potatoes, vegetables, and pumpkin pie. The scale of the feast stunned them. In Germany, even officers rarely saw such abundance during the war. For ordinary soldiers, the idea of eating like kings, while in captivity, was beyond belief. The message was not spoken but clear. This was a land so rich, it could give thanks by sharing with everyone, even its enemies. Religious freedom. Religion in Nazi Germany had been tightly controlled, often twisted into propaganda. In American camps, faith was different. Chaplains, both Catholic and Protestant, visited regularly. POWs were allowed to attend services freely. For many, this freedom was shocking. No one forced them to attend, no one dictated the message. They could believe, or not believe, without punishment. Some prisoners rediscovered their faith. Others, more importantly, discovered the concept of religious liberty itself. It was a living lesson in one of democracy's core values. Sundays in captivity. Unlike in Germany, where soldiers were often drilled relentlessly, Sundays in American camps felt different. Work paused. Men gathered to sing, play soccer, or simply rest. The rhythm of American life seeped into them. The idea that human beings deserved rest, leisure, and dignity even during war. It seemed a small thing, but for men who had lived under constant discipline and fear, it was revolutionary. Movies and music nights. Entertainment became another form of cultural diplomacy. Camps sometimes screened Hollywood films, comedies, musicals, Westerns. At first, many POWs resisted, dismissing them as frivolous. But laughter proved irresistible. Soon, they were quoting American actors and humming movie songs. Music nights featured jazz and swing. To Nazi-trained ears, these degenerate sounds were shocking at first. Yet over time, the rhythm, freedom, and joy of jazz captured their imagination. Jazz symbolized something bigger, a society not built on strict order and fear, but on creativity and freedom. Freedom within captivity. Perhaps the most powerful lesson came not from abundance or entertainment, but from the small freedoms allowed inside camp life. POWs could form clubs, publish camp newspapers, even debate politics in discussion groups. For the first time in their lives, many experienced free speech without fear of arrest. One prisoner later wrote, "Inside barbed wire, I felt freer than I ever had under Hitler." The irony was unmistakable. They had to lose the war to discover liberty. The quiet lesson of democracy. America never forced its ideology onto the prisoners with lectures or indoctrination. Instead, it let them live democracy through daily experience. Free worship, free expression, leisure and dignity, abundance and fairness. These quiet lessons, reinforced by holiday feasts and Sunday freedoms, proved more powerful than any propaganda film could have been. From prisoners to advocates. Years later, many former POWs remembered these holidays and freedoms as the turning point in their lives. They returned to Germany not as broken men, but as witnesses to another way of life. They had seen firsthand that a society could be rich, free, and humane, even to its enemies. And they carried those lessons into post-war Germany, helping to rebuild a nation on democratic foundations. Working in America's fields and factories. As the war raged in Europe, America faced a labor shortage. With millions of men overseas, farms and industries at home needed workers. German POWs filled the gap. They picked cotton in Texas, harvested corn in Iowa, cut timber in the Pacific Northwest, and even worked in canning factories. Always under guard, but often treated fairly, they saw firsthand the sheer scale of American productivity. Machines replaced dozens of men. Fields stretched endlessly. Even the food that POWs helped harvest dwarfed anything they had known in Germany. For many, this was a revelation. America's strength wasn't just military. It was economic, built on efficiency, freedom, and abundance. Surprising friendships. Though fraternization was officially discouraged, many POWs quietly formed bonds with American farmers and townspeople. Farm wives sometimes slipped extra food into their lunches. Children were curious rather than hateful. Some farmers even corresponded with former prisoners long after the war ended. This human contact was transformative. POWs realized that the enemy wasn't monstrous. It was ordinary people, living well and often kind. Returning to a broken Germany. When the war finally ended, most POWs returned home between 1946 and 1947. What awaited them was shocking. Cities reduced to rubble. Families starving. Black markets replacing stores. Children who had never seen chocolate or soda. After years of Coca-Cola, ice cream, and Thanksgiving turkeys, the contrast was unbearable. Some even wept when they saw the hunger in their homeland. They carried parcels of food home, sometimes smuggling chocolate bars and coffee to share with loved ones. These were treasures beyond price in a devastated Germany. The memory that wouldn't fade. For decades, former POWs remembered not the humiliation of defeat, but the taste of abundance in American camps. Coca-Cola became a lifelong symbol of America's strange power, soft, sweet, but undeniable. Ice cream sundaes and Thanksgiving turkeys were remembered with awe, sometimes even with guilt, knowing their families starved while they grew fat in captivity. But more than food, it was freedom and dignity that stuck. The right to worship, to rest on Sundays, to watch movies, to laugh, to be treated as human beings. Seeds of democracy. Historians later argued that these experiences were more powerful than any post-war policy. German POWs returned home as living witnesses that another world was possible. A world where the state served its people, not enslaved them. A world where abundance came from liberty, not conquest. A world where even enemies were treated with dignity. These men helped lay the foundations for West Germany's democratic rebirth. They became farmers, teachers, workers, and leaders who carried with them memories of a nation that defeated them with kindness as much as with weapons. The unlikely victory of ice cream and Coca-Cola. In the end, perhaps the strangest truth of World War II is this. Nazism, with all its brutality and ideology, was undone not only by bombs and tanks, but by something as simple as ice cream, Coca-Cola, and the freedom to celebrate Christmas. For the German POWs, captivity in America was a paradox. They lost the war, but in losing, they discovered a vision of life richer and freer than anything they had known. And for America, the real victory wasn't just on the battlefield. It was in showing the world that even in war, abundance, generosity, and humanity could be more persuasive than fear. They came expecting punishment. They left remembering Coca-Cola and ice cream. And in that unlikely sweetness, the seeds of a new Germany were planted.